All right, so just a minute, okay? I'm going to close my door at the back. All right, so we're going to be going through our lecture today, and our lecture is going to be all about your. Wait a minute. All right, so we're going to do our lecture today, and our lecture is going to be all about your nervous system. Okay, and we're going to start with the first lecture, and it's going to be central nervous system, and then we're going to do your cranial nerves, and then we'll do some models after that. Okay, so I'm going to share to you the PowerPoint for that lecture. Okay. Okay, so let me share it again, make sure that's the one you have. Right, and then I'm gonna use the pen. Okay, so you should be able to see my writing there on that PowerPoint, okay? All right, so what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna talk about the nervous system, okay? First part is called your CNS, central nervous system. But remember, in order for us to actually know the order of the different types of nervous system, we're going to summarize it here. Okay, so we're going to talk about nervous system, and we're going to divide it into two parts. Okay, so again, we need a strategy to actually study the nervous system. We just don't go all over the place. We got to put up our different regions. Okay, and first one is going to be the CNS. CNS is called your central nervous system. Okay, and the next one is going to be your PNS. PNS is your peripheral nervous system. So the CNS is anything in the middle. That's why you call it central. Okay, so it means it's made out of your brain, and also your spinal cord. And now we're going to be dividing the brain into the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and brainstem, and then your cerebellum. And then we're going to divide the brainstem into further three parts. Okay, your midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. All right, so we will follow this part here and talk about the CNS first, and then we're going to talk about the PNS later on. But today we're going to talk about one of the PNS called cranial nerves. So when you say PNS, peripheral nervous system, these are the nerves that exit out from the CNS. Okay, so the nerves that comes out from the brain, we call it cranial nerves, and then the nerves that comes out from your spinal cord, we call it your spinal nerves. And then there's going to be one that's called your autonomic nervous system, which is further divided into your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. Okay, so we're going to concentrate here first on the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so excuse me, give me 1 minute. All right, so we're back. Okay, so we're going to be concentrating on the system called CNS today, and we're going to start with the spinal cord. So we're starting from the bottom, and then we're going up into the brain. Okay, so, and that's actually the part one that we have here, the central nervous system. Okay, so next is going to be your Okay, so the central nervous system is divided into your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, I don't have my pen with me. Okay, so it's brain and spinal cord for the CNS. Okay, and we're gonna do the directional terms that are unique to the CNS. We say when you say rostral, that's toward the nose. It's gonna be towards the brain. When you say caudal, towards the tail, that's gonna be towards the spinal cord. Okay, so let's look at the spinal cord first. Okay, so the spinal nerves are attached to that. And these are your peripheral nervous system, the spinal nerves. It provides a two-way conduction pathway because in your spinal cord, okay, nerves go up into the spinal cord and then go up to the brain. Okay, these are called sensory. And then there's actually nerves that came from the brain and then go down to the spinal cord and exit out, and that's your motor. And that's the reason why they call it a two-way conduction pathway. Okay, you've got sensory and motor. Now, some of the reflexes occur on the spinal cord, okay, in which this is going to be your spinal cord and this is your brain. Usually, your nerves usually goes to the brain and it comes down from the brain, but sometimes they actually just act on the spinal cord and connect with another nerve and then comes out at the same level as the spinal cord. These are called reflex. Okay, so it doesn't need the brain to actually participate in this process. So reflex is similar to when you step on a nail, you immediately pull out your foot without the brain even telling it to pull out the foot from that pain. Okay, from that nail. That is called reflex. Okay, so that's going to be your physiology class. Now, let's take a look at the location of the spinal cord. Okay, so the spinal cord runs through what we call the vertebral canal. Remember, the vertebral canal is actually the whole of your vertebrae. So we talked about the vertebrae before, okay? And a hole where the spinal cord passes through is called the vertebral canal. So it came from the brain down, goes down into the vertebral canal. And they actually, so it came from the foramen magnum, and they actually end at L1 or L2 vertebrae. So they don't continue on to the bottom. Okay, so L1 and L2 is lumbar vertebrae 1, or sometimes extensor lumbar vertebrae 2. But remember, we have vertebrae up to the sacral 5. Okay, so it doesn't actually go down to that level. And that's the reason why let's take a look at the structure of the spinal cord based on to the place that they actually come in, okay, which is the spinal vertebral canal. So these are the vertebrae canals, okay, and the spinal cord starts from the foramen magnum and it goes down, okay, through the vertebral canal. And then from there, it actually stops here, okay, in a place that they stop is what we call the conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris is the inferior end of the spinal cord, okay? After that, it doesn't continue anymore down. So that level is going to be about L1 or L2, lumbar vertebrae 1 or lumbar vertebrae 2. Okay, so they stop there, but remember, the nerves still travel down to the bottom. So there's actually still nerves going down to the different holes of the vertebrae called intervertebral canals or intervertebral foramen. They still go out into the side. okay, and to the sacrum. So they actually still travel down to the side. So if you take a look at it, it actually like it looks like the horse tail, okay? So it's just nerves coming down, no more spinal cord. And that's the reason why we call it the cauda equina. The cauda equina, cauda means tail, equina means horse. It's a collection of spinal nerve roots that still goes down to the intervertebral foramen and exit out to the side, to the different vertebrae, from lumbar 3 to sacral 5, okay? So that's called the cauda equina. Now, there's another one there that actually is a thin filament that connects the conus medullaris, and this one attaches to the coccyx vertebrae. So this is a thin filament that holds on to the conus medullaris and attaches to the coccyx vertebrae. And that's called the filum terminale. It's made out of connective tissue. So the purpose of that filum terminale is to hold on to the spinal cord so that when you jump up and down, it doesn't recoil up and down, okay? Or else you're going to damage the spinal nerves. So that's actually existing at the end of the conus medullaris, and it actually ends and attaches to the vertebral coccyx vertebrae, okay? And then there's two enlargement here. We have the cervical enlargement, and then we have the lumbar enlargement. So there's two enlargement onto the vertebrae. So the reason why there's two enlargement is because, remember, nerves for the upper and the lower limbs will actually come from those enlargement. So the nerves from there would actually exit out and go to the arm, and this one is going to exit out and go to the leg and thigh and leg. Okay, and that's the reason why I have two enlargement located at the spinal cord called cervical and lumbar enlargement. Okay, all right. So the lateral view of the spinal cord. Okay, so just remember, there's 31 pairs of your spinal nerve, and but remember, there's only about how many cervical vertebrae do we have? 7. How many thoracic vertebrae we have? 12. How many lumbar do we have vertebrae? 5. And then how many sacral vertebrae fuse as one? We have 5. Okay. So we have 7. Okay. I'm missing something here. Okay. So the cervical is 7. Thoracic is 12. Lumbar is 5. And then your sacral is 5, and then I'm sorry, your coccyx is 1. Okay, so but if you take a look at it, okay, you're gonna actually count this out as 30 vertebrae. But apparently you have 31 pairs, so you have an extra one. Where did that come from? Okay, so just remember, it came actually above the C1. The spinal nerve C1 is above the atlas, okay? So that's actually an extra one. That's the reason why I got 31 pairs. So there's 31 pairs of your spinal nerve, okay? So the segments indicates the cords from which spinal nerves emerges, such as cervical spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, and the sacral spinal nerves, okay? And they're designated by numbers, okay? And example is going to be T1. When you say T1 is region where the first thoracic nerve emerges. That's going to be T1. So we're going to be using that as a description of the spinal nerve. You got C1 here. Okay, that's an extra one above the first cervical vertebrae. So we got C1. Then so we'll have C8 until C8 for the cervical. Okay, that's why you got 8, 12, 5, and 5, and 1. So 31 pairs of that, okay? So let's take a look at your spinal cord, okay? So we got to study about the anatomy of the spinal cord. So just remember, our neuron is made out of dendrites. Okay, so this is actually similar to the one we studied on the tissue, the cell body, and your axon. At the end is going to be a synapse. So this is going to be the dendrite in which it receives stimulus, okay, either from another neuron, and then they pass on that stimulus to the cell body. And remember, there's a nucleus there. And then after it passes on the cell body, then the stimulus goes down into the axon. Then at the end of the axon is what we call the synapse. The synapse, it actually synapses with either a muscle or another neuron. So you get another neuron here, it is dendrites, cell body, and then axon. Or you'll have a skeletal muscle as within that area in which this will stimulate that skeletal muscle. Okay, so that's actually what a neuron looks like. Okay, so we have cell body, dendrite, cell body, and axon. Now, when you have a lot of cell bodies, so a group of cell bodies of the neuron, and you got dendrites there, then each of them has their own axons. Okay, so a group of cell bodies is called a nuclei. And most of the nuclei have a certain purpose in the CNS. So they don't have myelin sheath. So the axons have this fat covering around the nerve, okay? And when you see that on your CNS, they're gonna look like white because of the fats. So that's the reason why we call it the white matter, or what we call white columns. So all the white columns you see in your brain and your spinal cord, they're actually made out of axons. It's just like telephone wires going up and down or crossing to the other side. So they're actually what we call your columns or the white matter. So white matter is made out of your axon, okay? And then the group of cell bodies, they're gonna be darker because they don't have myelin sheath, okay? So this one has the myelin sheath at the axon. That's why it looks white. And then the cell bodies don't have myelin sheath. That's the reason why they're going to actually be a little bit dark. Okay, the color would actually be darker, such as dark brown. And that's the reason why we call it the gray matter. So the white matter and the gray matter are just based on the composition of this neuron. Okay, so if you take a look at this vertebrae, the spinal cord, okay, I see a structure like looks like a butterfly, okay, on the center. That structure is what we call the gray matter. So all of this is made out of cell bodies, okay? And then in the middle of that is going to be a hole, and that hole is called your central canal. So the hole in the middle is called the central canal. Because the cerebrospinal fluid of the brain continues onto the central canal. So the CSF fluid is going to flow into the central canal of the spinal cord inside the spinal cord, okay? And the brain has a CSF floating on the ventricles, then it communicates with the central canal of the spinal cord. And that's what the central canal of the spinal cord is. Okay, now the problem here is, remember, the terminology that we use for the location of the structures in the spinal cord, they usually use the word posterior or dorsal. And then they usually use the word anterior or ventral. Okay, same as here, the gray matter. So the way to identify it is to actually know the location of this, of the structure of the spinal cord, okay? Who's my posterior, who's my anterior, or who's my dorsal, and who's my ventral, okay? So the landmark, okay, that you're gonna be using is gonna be this part here of the gray matter that has this pointed structure touching to the edge of the spinal cord. Okay, so the other side is flat, it's round. It doesn't touch the edge of the spinal cord. Here, it's actually sharp. It touches the end of the spinal cord. So that's going to be a landmark. So when you see that, anything here is going to be posterior then. Anything here is posterior, or what we call dorsal. So that's going to be a landmark about position. Okay. So anything in front here is going to be anterior, or what we call ventral. All right. So now let's identify the different white matter and the gray matter. So the white matter is called white columns. Sometimes they're called funiculus. Okay. Sometimes they're called fasciculus, or they just call it white matter. Okay. They just follow a book. The funiculus, group of funiculus, is going to be the white column. Okay. And here is going to be the horns. Okay. And a group of horns is going to be the gray matter. Okay, so now let's identify the gray and the white matter in this picture. I'm going to take off the labels so we can see it better. So this area of the gray matter, located at the posterior part of the spinal cord, we're going to call it the dorsal or posterior horn. Okay, so you got one on left and one right. Remember, patient's right, not your right. Okay, so those are your posterior horn. And then the round portion here of the gray matter, we're going to call it the ventral or anterior horn. Okay. Then there's also the one on the side, and that's going to be lateral horn. So lateral horn, dorsal horn, ventral horn, those are gray matter which made out of cell bodies. Now the white matter is actually made out of your axons. Okay, so it's just like telephone wires. These are where they actually go up and or down. So the area here is on the dorsal side. So I'm going to call it dorsal posterior funiculus. And the one here on the side, I'm going to call it the lateral funiculus. And the one here at the bottom or the anterior side, I'm going to call it the ventral or anterior funiculus. Okay, so those are just locations of the neuron tissue located inside your spinal cord. Okay, so we're finished with identifying the gray matter and the white matter. Now let's take a look now at the nerves that exit out from the spinal cord. Okay, so there's going to be some rootlets here. Okay, but generally they become as a root. So all this is going to become your dorsal root. Remember location. So it's located at the posterior portion. So we're going to call it the dorsal root. And then there's another one here located with rootlets, and then they become one as your ventral root. Okay, so what's the difference between a dorsal and a ventral root? So I'm going to change it to green. So dorsal root, they're made out of sensory nerve. So they came from the outside of the spinal nerve. They enter into your they enter the spinal cord, and after that, because it's sensory, they have to go up into the brain. Okay, because they're sensory. Now, once the brain got the information from the sensory receptor, it has to respond. And respond by a motor nerve. So they go down to the spinal cord. Okay, and then they enter here. Then they synapse with another neuron. And then from there, here there's going to be two new neurons too. Okay, they synapse, and then the other one goes up. Here it goes down, synapse with another neuron, then exit out here at the ventral root. So what that means that dorsal root is made out of sensory nerves. And then your ventral root is made out of motor nerves. They're made out of motor, okay? So motor, then after that they go out here, and then they join the sensory, and then they become as a nerve, okay? So the area where the sensory and the motor meet, this area back here, that is going to be the spinal nerve, Okay, so is the question here in the exam is what is the part of that peripheral nervous system that has motor only? That's going to be the ventral roots of the that part of the spinal cord. Okay, so what does have sensory only? That's going to be the dorsal root. Okay, but what is the part of the spinal cord nerves that has both motor and sensory? And that's going to be the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve has motor plus sensory. Okay, all right. So exactly take a look again at your dorsal root. The dorsal root has your sensory nerve. Okay, and remember it goes back into the spinal cord. But there's actually something unique in the dorsal root. Okay, it has what we call the dorsal root ganglion. Here is actually made out of the cell bodies of the neuron. Okay, that's the reason why they have this ganglion, because a neuron of sensory nerve has the cell body in the middle instead of the one similar to your motor, in which it's at the edge. Okay, so the accumulation of the cell bodies together at the dorsal root, that's going to be what we call the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. All right, so we finished with the different roots, nerves that is coming out from the spinal cord. Now let's take a look at this air back here. This is the gray matter that connects the left and right. So when you say connect, we're going to call it a commissure. So this is called the gray commissure. Okay. And then remember that hole in the middle is called the central canal. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through that hole. Okay, and then let's take a look at the saran wrap that covers the spinal cord. Whatever you see here in the spinal cord, you also see in the central nervous system. So the first and most superficial saran wrap is called your dura mater. This is made out of your connective tissue. And after the dura mater is going to be the arachnoid matter, A. And then the last one is going to be called the pia. So the pia matter is the one that's adherent to the spinal cord or to the brain. So there's no space between them. So those are the three meninges called dura, arachnoid, and pia. Okay. So whatever you see in the spinal cord, the meninges, is same covering of the meninges of the brain. All right, so we talk about the white matter, the outer region of the spinal cord. It's composed of myelinated and unmyelinated axon. So they allow communication between the spinal cord and the brain. So that's the reason we call it a two-way pathway. One going up, okay, which is going to be sensory, and one going down, which is going to be motor. Okay? So we have ascending fibers for sensory, descending fibers for motor, and then there's going to be fibers called commissural fibers in which they connect from one side, okay, to the other side of the brain or the spinal cord. Okay, now let's take a look now at the gray commissure. We talked about the gray commissure, in which inside of it is going to be the central canal. It's shaped like the letter H of the gray matter. So the dorsal horn, okay, they're actually the one that connects the interneurons, and the ventrolateral horns contain cell bodies of your motor neurons. Okay, so interneurons are just connection out from the dorsal horn, sensory, into the motor directly, such as your reflex. Okay, but the ventrolateral horn, okay, most of them are actually called motor neurons. Okay, cell bodies of motor neurons. All right, so let's go now into the spinal cord. Now, this is easy to identify, which is it is inside the vertebrae. Now, but remember, on the lab exam, you might not have the vertebrae in front of you, so you're going to depend on that landmark, okay? That sharp part of the gray matter that touches the edge of the spinal cord, that's going to be your posterior, okay? But here, we're going to see it. This is a cervical vertebrae because we have the bifid styloid process. So we know that the styloid process is located at the posterior, so we know the location now, okay? So let's talk about here the spinal meninges. Again, I said dura is the outer layer. This is the dura. Okay. And then the other layer is going to be the arachnoid. So what does arachnoid mean? Arachnoid means spider. Okay, so if you notice that this arachnoid matter has this structure that looks like webs down the bottom. Looks like spider webs. And then the last layer is going to be your pia. Okay, so the pia is the one adherent to the spinal cord and also to the brain. That's your pia here. Okay, so now between the three, we have the spaces now. So the space above the dura, okay, and again, don't try to memorize the structure, okay, decipher the name. The space between above the dura, which is between the dura and the bone, that's going to be called the epidural space. Epi means above, okay? So that's going to be the space between the dura and the bone. We're going to call it the epidural space. Now, the other one is going to be the subdural space, or the space below the dura, okay? And then the other one is going to be the subarachnoid space, below the arachnoid matter, arachnoid and yeah, okay. So what's actually the significance here in the clinical aspect of the spaces, okay? Now, epidural space contains arterial blood vessel. Subdural spaces contains venous blood vessel. When you say arterial blood vessel, it has pressure, okay? Then venous does not have pressure. So if you hear the word an epidural hemorrhage, okay, that means it is an arterial bleed. Arterial bleed has pressure. So when the arterial bleed happens at the epidural space, what's going to happen is it's going to push the brain to the side, to the brain or spinal cord. And it's going to kill that part, and it's going to kill the tissue, the neurons inside the brain. So an epidural hemorrhage is fatal. Okay, so the only way to actually help you out with an epidural hemorrhage is to kind of hold on your skull. Okay, so we're mostly looking at the head. When somebody falls and hit their head and they have epidural hemorrhage, that's going to be arterial. So remember, the skull is a closed cavity and the brain's inside. So if you don't relieve that pressure, it's going to push the brain and kill the brain. Okay, and that's called necrosis. So in order to be relieved about this epidural hemorrhage, you gotta cut a hole onto the skull. So that hole is called your burr hole. Okay, so the burr hole is necessary in order to relieve the pressure. Okay, now if you have a subdural hemorrhage, it's just gonna give you headaches. That's all, or change of behavior. But usually it's just because it's not have pressure, so it's not actually gonna affect the brain. Okay, so it's gonna be not as much as the epidural hemorrhage. Now, the subarachnoid is made out of your cerebrospinal fluid. Remember, the cerebrospinal fluid is inside the brain and the spinal cord, but it's also outside the brain and the spinal cord. So that's where the CSF fluid will actually flow, the subarachnoid space. Okay. Now, if you also take a look at the butterfly, the gray matter, this is going to be the dorsal horn, lateral horn, and the ventral horn. And then you got the white matter is going to be the dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, and ventral funiculus. Okay, I've got to actually ask you about this cuts. Okay, in between your spinal cord. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that. Okay, here is actually just indentation on the dorsal side. That's why we call it a dorsal median sulcus. Sulcus is just an indentation. But here you got a big cut, okay? And that's the reason why we call it a fissure. So we call it a ventral median fissure, okay? So that's the one you see in the middle of the spinal cord, okay? And here's gonna be the dorsal median sulcus, okay? And here's gonna be the ventral median fissure, meaning a deeper cut, okay? And then let's follow the dorsal root. So I got your dorsal root here. Okay, remember this is sensory. So this is the one going back into the spinal cord. So I'm just following it out here. And then after that, it actually becomes this bulge. That's going to be the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. And then from there, it actually meets with because this is sensory, it will meet with the motor. Motor is ventral root. Ventral root travels down, and you don't have a ganglion there. So then it meets up with the dorsal root. So now the spinal nerve right here, which is going to be here, is made out of motor and sensory. Okay. So the motor nerve and the sensory nerve meets up at your spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is the one that you actually see protruding out to the side of your vertebrae. Okay, the dorsal root and the ventral root and the dorsal root ganglion, they're hidden inside the vertebrae, so you don't see it coming out. Okay, so the only thing that you see coming out would be the spinal nerve. Okay, so the point here is going to be the spinal nerve. Okay. Remember, this is not a spinal nerve. This is not a spinal nerve. There's a terminology that we use this. We call it a ramus. So the ramus is a branch of the spinal nerve that goes down at the ventral portion. That's why we call it ventral ramus. And this ramus is the one that goes up to the back. That's why we call it the dorsal ramus. And we're going to study that mostly on the spinal nerves, okay? The spinal nerve chapter. All right, so we finished with that, and then now we've actually seen this before, so we can identify all the things that you see here now, okay? All right, so I said dorsal horn has interneurons, meaning interneurons for the reflex, and the lateral and the ventral has what you call the visceral motor, okay? Sub-bodies on the lateral horn and the somatic motor out here at the ventral horn. Okay. All right. So now let's go on down into we talk about your dura mater, arachnoid, and pia. Now let's talk about your cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So from the spinal cord, now we're actually going up to the CNS. Okay. So again, remember the fluid that is flowing from the central canal. This is spinal cord. It actually connects to the ventricles of your CNS. It floats on the ventricles of the CNS. Apparently, the fluid is actually made at the area of the lateral ventricle and the fourth ventricle here of the brain. Those are actually what we call your choroid plexus. So choroid plexus are actually blood vessels, arterial blood vessels that actually give off this fluid into the ventricles. So the cavities in the brain is called the ventricles. So the fluid inside the brain is actually cushions the spinal cord of the brain. It also nourishes the brain and spinal cord. It also removes waste and carries chemical signals between parts of the CNS. Okay? So we're going to be looking at those ventricles again, okay, once we go to the brain. But right now, we just note that the central canal of the spinal cord connects with the ventricles of the brain. Okay. Now, this is the area of the spinal cord in which there's no more spinal. This is going to be the area of your spinal cavity, and remember the conus medullaris is where the end of the spinal cord finishes, and that's between L2, okay, L1 to L2. All right, and after that, the only thing you see are nerves coming down. These are called your cauda equina. Those are the nerves that comes down. So there's going to be still fluid coming out from this part here, and that's going to be called the subarachnoid space. In that subarachnoid space, as cerebrospinal fluid, it connects with the cerebrospinal fluid of the brain. That's why when we do a lumbar tap, we insert a needle, okay, between L4 and L5 vertebrae. Then that needle will suck in that fluid and then put it in a syringe. Okay? That is to diagnose meningitis or infection of the meninges, especially the one in the brain. Okay, So that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is at the subarachnoid space. So now we have the brain now, okay? So we finished with the spinal cord, okay? We're going to the brain, okay? Now let's talk about the cavities of the brain. These are called ventricles. So generally, the brain used to be just a tube. Then it becomes vesicles, 3 vesicles. And the vesicles called your forebrain, midbrain, and your hindbrain, called prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombsencephalon. And then from there, the prosencephalon divides into 2, the telin and the dian. This part here becomes 2 parts, the telin and the dian. The mesen stays as mesen, only 1. And the rhombencephalon becomes the metin and myelin, 2, and also the cerebellum. Okay? So now if you take a look at the brain, okay, it's actually made out of these different parts that we're going to trace it out to the adult brain structures. So when I say what region of the brain are you talking about, you're going to actually tell me, is it at the cerebrum, diencephalon, at the brainstem, which is made out of the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, or at the back of the cerebellum, okay? And then that's one that connects to the spinal cord, okay? So again, those are the regions of the brain. The structure of the brain is divided into your cerebrum. That was a summary that I did on the first part. The cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, which is divided into MPM, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Then we have the cerebellum, okay? So now, the main part about anatomy, as I said, landmark, okay? Now, if I study the cross-section of a brain, I'm going to look at it as a city scan. So it's actually a cross-sectional cut of the brain. I want to know where I am, okay? And a way to actually identify this, the level where you're actually looking at on the CT scan, you're going to use the ventricles. So the lateral ventricles, if I see the lateral ventricles, then it's going to be at the area of the cerebrum. And if I see the third ventricle, it's going to be at the area of the diencephalon. And if I see the cerebral aqueduct, it's going to be at the area of the midbrain. In the fourth ventricle, that's going to be the area of the pons, medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. So those are the areas that I look on for landmarks, okay? So because remember, we cannot survive without landmarks in them. All right, here is going to be the 4 regions, divided in 4 regions of the brain, okay? All this thing that looks like a cauliflower structure, that is called the cerebrum. And then this part here, that's all purple, okay? All of this is going to be called the diencephalon. And they're actually divided into 3 parts, such as the cerebrum is also divided into parts. Remember, they've got the frontal lobe, okay? The parietal lobe, the occipital, and temporal lobe, okay? So when we hear that word F-pod, remember, that was actually from the bone, okay? The lobes located at the frontal bone is the frontal lobe. The lobe located at the parietal bone is the parietal lobe. Occipital bone, occipital lobe, temporal bone, the temporal lobe. So those are the different parts of the cerebrum. Now for the diencephalon, we got 3 parts. The thalamus is the structure that looks like an egg. Okay. Then the one at the bottom here is below. So we're going to call it the hypothalamus. There's one here at the back. It's not visible here. You can see it on the back view later on. That is called the epithalamus. Okay. But generally, the structure is called the diencephalon. Okay. So if I say what part of the brain you are in, you can actually tell me, am I at the cerebrum, diencephalon, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, or cerebellum? Okay. So that's actually all the structures there. So we're going to look at the development of the organization of the brain. Okay, so on the spinal cord, we got gray matter in the middle and white matter outside. Okay, now if you go higher than that, on the brainstem, you got gray matter in the middle, some gray matter onto the side, and white matter. If you go higher, such as cerebellum or cerebrum, they're going to have gray matter in the middle, some gray matter in the sides, white matter around it, and then another gray at the exterior. Okay, those are the cortex. So that's actually what the organization of the brain and the spinal cord is going to be. Okay, the outer layer of the gray is called your cortex, and it's located at the cerebellum and cerebellum. All right, so now we're back to our ventricles. Okay, ventricles are cavities inside the brain. So our ventricles, if you take a look at our ventricles, okay, the cerebellum has this J-shaped looking cavities inside. That is called your lateral ventricle. Okay, it's going to be the lateral ventricle. They're located at the cerebrum. So we got different parts of the lateral ventricle. We got the inferior horn and anterior horn. Okay, and we have the anterior horn here. We have the posterior horn here, and we have the inferior horn here. Okay, so those are the different parts of the lateral ventricle. So when I see the lateral ventricle, I'm at the cerebrum. Okay, now after that, it connects here to this ventricle. This one is because the thalamus is located there. Okay, that's part of the diencephalon. And this one is going to be the third ventricle. So the lateral ventricles connect to each other by what we call the interventricular foramen. So the interventricular foramen connects the two lateral ventricles, and then they connect into the third ventricle right here. It's your third ventricle. So the connection is called interventricular foramen. And then after that, okay, so remember, when I say cerebral, what do you call lateral ventricle, I'm at the cerebrum. When I say third ventricle, I'm at the diencephalon. When I say cerebral aqueduct, which is actually going to be thinner, so the canal is going to be thin, that is called the cerebral aqueduct. And now I'm at the area of the midbrain. So this is midbrain here. This is diencephalon here. And then from cerebral aqueduct becomes like a square-looking ventricle. That's going to be called the fourth ventricle. So when I see the fourth ventricle, I'm actually located between the pons, medulla oblongata, or the cerebellum. Okay, because remember, this is inside the tissue of the brain, inside that brain itself, those ventricles. Now, there's actually another opening there, and you would actually notice that why does the water go out from the brain or the spinal cord? Because now it's floating in the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space is outside the brain. So let me actually take a look at all these labels. So the ventricles has the fluid floating inside them, okay? But there's also, so again, fluid is going here, fluid is going here, and then meets up here. But also there's a hole to the side, okay? That hole is called the lateral aperture. That's when it will go to the subarachnoid space around the brain, okay? Remember, the subarachnoid space is between the arachnoid and the pia mater. So now we have fluid also flowing to the outside of the brain and the spinal cord, okay? And it is to better cushion those structures because it can actually reduce damage, okay? So the hole is to the side, that's going to be the lateral aperture, okay? And then there's a hole here to the back, we call it the median aperture. And those are the two holes that connects ventricles down to the subarachnoid space, okay? Where the cerebrospinal fluid is actually still flowing. Okay, so those are my ventricles, okay? Just remember, you need to know what are the different ventricles located at a different part of the brain, okay? So we finished with ventricles, now we're gonna go higher now. So we finished with the spinal cord, I'm gonna go down to the brain. But the first thing that, when I reach the brain, is gonna be the brainstem. Brainstem is made out of midbrain pons medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is the one that goes to the spinal cord. So functions of the brainstem, okay, It's going to be automatic behaviors for survival. Okay. And then it's a passageway for all fiber tracts running between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. So it's just like an opening so that the nerves from the spinal cord will communicate with the cerebrum. Okay. So that is what the brain stands for. Okay, and one thing about that from now on, okay, I want you to summarize what you see on the different parts of the brain. So again, we have the cerebrum, we have the diencephalon. So we're going to summarize this together. And then we have the midbrain, we have the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and then also the cerebellum. Remember the spelling of cerebellum is with a double L, okay? Cerebellum. Okay, so now let's talk about the things that are supposed to be within this part of the brain. Okay, so again, this is your summary now. The cranial nerves are nerves that exit out from the brain. Where do they belong? Okay, cranial nerves 1 and 2 is cerebrum. Cranial nerves 3 and 1 and 2 is cerebrum and diencephalon. Cranial nerves 3 and 4, that's part of the midbrain. Cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7. That's part of the pons. Cranial nerves 8 to 12. There's only 12 cranial nerves. That's part of the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is going to be endpoint of the brain. Okay, cerebellum is actually they handle equilibrium movement generally. The main purpose is that for equilibrium. So I got the nerves on different parts of the brain. Okay, so move on. So these are the cranial nerves that exit out. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it later on when we go to the topic of cranial nerves. This is cranial nerve 2, optic nerve. This is 1, cranial nerve 1, in which nerves exit out to the bottom. Okay, so we'll do that. Talk about that later on. All right, so now we're at the medulla oblongata. So what should I see at the medulla oblongata? Okay, again, summarize everything on each part of your brain. And this is actually the one that is going to be asking you on the lab exercise. Where do you see the pyramids? Okay, so they're going to ask you, where do you see the pyramids? That pyramid is found at the medulla oblongata. Okay, what does the medulla oblongata's ventricle has? It is called the fourth ventricle. Okay, what else do you see at the medulla oblongata? You can see the decussation of the pyramid. And explain to you what it does mean later on once we go up to the cerebrum. Okay, so we got pyramids, decussation of pyramids, and then I know we're going to encounter what we call the olive. Okay, so let's go back here. Now we have the cranial nerves. This is medulla oblongata. The cranial nerves. What does the cranial nerve of the medulla oblongata have? Cranial nerves 8 to 12. That belongs to the medulla oblongata. Okay, and also we have this thing called the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So the olive, this is actually going to be the area of the olive here to the side. Olive is part of the medulla, and the other one is going to be the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So we say peduncle is a connection from one part of the brain to the other. So this one is connecting the brainstem to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The medulla is part of the brainstem. Okay, so let's take a look at the structures here. So here is going to be the area where the pyramid is on this picture. Okay, not as obvious, but it's in between these two cunyados, or what we call ridges. Okay, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. Now the pyramids get there. So what is below that pyramid? It's going to be the decussation of the pyramid. Okay, the decussation of the pyramid. What does decussation of the pyramid mean? Remember, the nerves to the right side of your brain travel down to the bottom and crosses over to the opposite side of the body. Okay, That is the reason why there's a decussation there. So the decussation is the area where nerves in the brain will cross over to the other side, okay? Because it doesn't come down straight. It doesn't come down to the right side of the brain, to the right side of the spinal cord. You're going to decussate to the other side. That's the reason why when somebody has a stroke onto the right brain, the paralysis is usually the left, okay? So the paralysis is usually the left. Okay, so those are the things I see in the medulla oblongata, pyramids, fixation pyramids, in my nerves. Cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this is 5, one of the biggest nerve in the body, which is going to be the brainstem. 5, and then again, do it like a clock. 5, and then after that you got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then, I'm sorry, this is 11. The one to the side called spinal accessory. And then the one in the middle is going to be the 12 here. Okay, so remember, we're going to identify that better on the topic called cranial nerve. Okay, so these are the structures that we actually need to understand and identify the area of the medulla oblongata. And we have actually noted that the pyramids, the fourth ventricle, the pyramidal decussation, the olive, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and cranial nerves 8 to 12 is a component of the medulla oblongata. Okay, so when we look at the side view of the brain, I can actually see better the olive. So this is the olive located here at the medulla oblongata, and the nerves are going to be. This one starts with cranial nerve 6. Okay, so remember our nerves is 5. So let me actually write it down. So the nerves that we actually talk about, cranial nerve 8 to 12. Cranial nerves 8 to 12. That's the one that belongs to the medulla oblongata. Okay. So these are the other structures. How do I look at the inferior cerebellar in the olive? Side view. I want the medulla, the dark green is the medulla oblongata. This bump here to see in the lateral side, that is called the olive. And then the connection between the brainstem and to the cerebellum, called the inferior cerebellar peduncle, that came from the medulla. Okay, so let me summarize now for the other parts now. Now we have midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So this part actually goes into what we call the middle cerebellar peduncle. This connects the pons to the medulla oblongata. Okay, so that's where the pons will communicate into the medulla oblongata. The midbrain communicates through what we call the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So to connect from the medulla into the structure in what we call the inferior cerebellar peduncle, okay, to the cerebellum. Right? Now for the pons, it will pass through what we call the middle cerebellar peduncle. That's for the pons. And for the midbrain, it was going to communicate with the medulla oblongata, midbrain to the cerebellum. So what we call the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, remember the word, the spelling, cerebellar. Okay, because it's going to the cerebellum. Right. So those are the structures that you need to identify in the medulla oblongata. Okay, and then we're gonna go higher. Okay, and this is the fourth ventricle. Sorry, let me actually get into this first. The fourth ventricle is open, and you can actually see the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. Remember, the choroid plexus is arterial blood vessels, and then the other one that secretes the fluid into the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so we finished with the medulla oblongata. Now we're going higher down to the pons. So what are the things that I should see on the pons? Okay, this part of the brainstem. The cranial nerves 5. So the pons. So on the pons, again, the fourth ventricle is there with the pons. Fourth ventricle is located at the pons. And then the cranial nerves that is located at the pons is cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7. And we'll deal with the name, the specific name that when we to the cranial nerve. Cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7. Inside the pons is what we call the pontine nuclei. It connects portions of the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. Okay, so that's going to be called the pontine nuclei. So you don't see it from the outside. The only way you can see it is when you cut through the pons. Okay, it sends axons to the cerebellum through the middle cerebellum peduncle. That is going to be called your pontine nuclei. Remember, it connects the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. So this is where the pontine nuclei is. Okay, those are gray matter. Okay, so now the fourth ventricle, this is how it looks like on the fourth ventricle. It looks like a square-looking cavity. That's what a fourth ventricle looks like. So remember, when I do a CT scan, I'm going to take a look at the shape of the ventricle. So if it looks like a square shape, I'm at the fourth. So on the fourth, meaning I'm actually at the area between the pons, medulla, pons, and then our midbrain. I'm sorry, pons, medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. Okay, so when I see the fourth ventricle, I'm within that area. The cerebellum is supposed to be here. Okay, which is not on this picture. So that's the reason why I use a landmark of ventricles in order to tell me the location that I have. Okay, so this is the pontine nuclei connecting the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebrum is upstairs to the cerebellum. Okay, so that's my pontine nuclei. All right, and then, okay, I don't have anything more to add in that, okay? So these are the structures that I need to actually identify my fourth ventricle, cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and my pontine nuclei. Okay, so now we're going up now. So we start with medulla, now pons, and then we're gonna go to midbrain, okay? So the midbrain is the upper part of the brainstem. So this is my medulla oblongata. This is my pons. Now this is my midbrain. Okay, so I see only two things on the midbrain here, the front, but I see a couple more at the back. Okay, so let's take a look at the midbrain. It lies between the diencephalon and the pons. And what does it have? Midbrain, again, summarize it. Midbrain has the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct is actually located at your midbrain. The cerebral aqueduct. Okay, it's a small ventricle. The fourth ventricle is big, square looking. Suddenly it becomes small. When it becomes small, a small circle, that is called the cerebral aqueduct. So when I see it on the CT scan, I know I'm at the midbrain. Okay, nowhere else, because cerebral aqueduct is only seen in the midbrain. Now the cerebral peduncles, okay, the one that is on the front of the pons, I mean the midbrain, this structures here that goes to the front, the medium green colored structure, okay, that is called the cerebral peduncle. Okay, located in the ventral surface of the brain, they actually have tracks that passes through them, okay, and you'll likely notice that we call it a pyramidal track that passes through them. And then there's going to be a superior cerebellar peduncle. This one's cerebral. This one's superior cerebellar peduncle that connects this part of the midbrain to the cerebellum. Okay, so let's take a look at those structures. So here I'm going to see the, and also forgive me, I'm going to write it down here. See the cerebral aqueduct. See the cerebral peduncle in the front. Remember the nerves here is cranial nerves 3 and 4. Okay, and then you have the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is a part of the midbrain. Okay, I want to know if I have the peduncles for the pons. Okay, all right, for the pons, you have the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so you have the middle cerebellar peduncle connecting the pons to the cerebellum. The midbrain is connected by the superior cerebellar peduncle, connecting the midbrain to the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata has the inferior cerebellar peduncle connecting it to the cerebellum. Okay. All right, so let's finish out with the midbrain. Okay, identify the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, identify the cerebral peduncle. Okay, and then identify the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, and then we have a couple more things here that you need to identify. Identify the corpora quadrigemini. Corpora, body, quadri, four, Gemini, twins. Okay, so that's located at the back. So we have those parts here that is going to be located at the back here. This is called the corpora quadrigemini. The one at the back. The one in the front is called cerebral peduncle in the midbrain. And the one in the back is going to be called your corpora quadrigemini. Okay, and this is going to be what it looks like at the back. Okay, so remember the front of the cerebrum, that's your cerebral peduncle. The back, this is what the back looks like. Okay, as the cerebellum is removed, this is all called the corpora quadrigemini. Quadri, four, corpora quadrigemini. But the two bumps that you see on top, those are called your superior colliculus, and the one at the bottom is called your inferior colliculus. Okay, remember that is part of the midbrain. Okay, that's going to be a part of the midbrain. Right. So again, let's go back to that. Okay, should be able to identify this on the midbrain, the cerebral aqueduct, the cerebral peduncle. Then we have the superior cerebellar peduncle. Then we have the corpora quadrigemini. Okay, so this is cerebral peduncle, and cranial nerves 3 and 4 is here. Cranial nerves 3 and 4, and the sign is going to be your cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and one of the things that are located in the midbrain, two important pigmented nuclei, okay, is actually called the substantia nigra, which is going to be made out of neuron cell bodies that contain melanin, and it's linked to the basal nuclei, and the other one is called the red nucleus. Lies deep on the substantia nigra. Okay, so these are things that are associated with Parkinsonism. Okay, so in that area of the midbrain. So, but Parkinsonism is actually more on the lack of the dopamine, okay, neurotransmitters. All right, so we finished with everything, okay, at the brainstem. Now we're going to the back, the cerebellum, okay. It actually produces what we call coordination of body movement and help maintain equilibrium. So there's the cerebral hemispheres, and it has three lobes: anterior, posterior, flocculonodular lobe. The ridges are called folia, and those separations between the folia is going to be called fissures. So just remember, in the cerebrum, the folia is your gyrus. In the cerebellum, the ridges are the separation called fissures, but on the higher portion of the brain, they're called especially the cerebrum, they call them your sulcus. Okay. All right, so we have the three lobes. Okay, so let's identify those three lobes. This is the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. This is the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. And this is going to be the flocculonodular part of the cerebellum. And remember, the outer portion is your gray cerebellar cortex. It's made out of cell bodies, so it's dark, gray matter. But the middle portion here, okay, is white matter. And if you notice, the white matter looks like branches of trees. And that's the reason why they call this white matter arbor vitae. Arbor means trees. Okay? So the white matter is called arbor vitae. Okay? Now, if you take a look at now the connection between the brainstem to the cerebellum, the superior, the, the superior cerebellar peduncle comes from the midbrain. That's the one that connects to the cerebellum. The one that is for the pons, we call it the middle cerebellar peduncle. That's the one that connects to the cerebellum. And the last one is going to be the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's the one that connects the medulla to the cerebellum. Okay. All right. So we finished with, and if you're wondering what this is the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. Okay. I'm gonna just put MID, means midbrain. And then at the back of that, these are your corpora quadrigemini of the midbrain. Remember the two upper holes are called your superior colliculus. And the one at the bottom, there's two bumps. That's going to be your inferior colliculus. Okay. All right. So we finished with the cerebellum. Let's go up now into the next one is going to be the diencephalon. Okay. So the diencephalon is the next structure after the midbrain. Okay. So the diencephalon then goes out into what we call the cerebrum. And then after that, we're done with the CNS. Okay. After that, we're done with CNS. And then we're going to take a look at the cranial nerves that exit out from the brain. It's called cranial nerves. Okay. So I'm going to give you a break now, okay, because we have the next topic. And the next topic, we're going to continue with the diencephalon to the cerebrum, and then we'll continue on with the cranial nerve. Okay. So our break is going to be let's say 6:30, and then we'll see each other at 7:00. Okay. So we're going to have a break here so that I don't have a 4-hour lecture video for you guys. So we're going to only have that break. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to see you at 7:00. So I'm going to give you another invitation just in case you get lost, okay? And it's going to be at the announcement of your canvas, right? I'll see you at 7:00.